Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is part D of lecture 4 on Descriptive Statistics and Islamic Approach. This lecture provides a different method of computing the price index and inflation. This new method is more intuitive and easier to understand. In the previous lecture, we looked at a list of 11 commodities in the sensitive price index and set some arbitrary units of quantity to be purchased. We calculated the prices of these quantities in October 18th and then again in October 19th. That gives us an inflation rate for each commodity. These inflation rates varied from 18% to minus 8%. And taking a weighted average of these according to the amount of money spent for each commodity, that gives us an inflation rate. So this is the method from the previous lecture. Now we will do the same thing but in a different way, which is easier to understand. When you have one commodity, the inflation rate is easy to understand because the price of that commodity is well defined, and then how the price changes, that's the inflation. But when you have many different prices and they're all changing in different ways, then the idea of inflation becomes much more complex. And so we used a weighted average of all of the changes. The weights that we used were the money spent on the commodity, and that captures the importance of the commodity within the budget. But the problem is that these weights keep changing with time. As we noted in Pakistan, the Bureau of Statistics uses the fiscal year 2008, even though we are calculating inflation in 2018 and 19. So this is a little bit strange. That's because data is on the weights requires updating, and this is not easily available. Price data is much more easily available. A second problem with the weights is that these weights are aggregate over the whole nation, and these might not be accurate and representative for different groups within the nation. So we will see how these problems can be addressed by a different method. This table reproduces a table from the previous lecture. Here we have the unit quantities of each of these 11 commodities. Then we have the prices, and the third column gives the sales. The sales were given in millions of rupees. Here we have given the sales in thousands of rupees. So there was wheat flour was sold in 10,901.4 thousand rupees were spent on wheat flour. The price was computed to be 182, and so the quantity that was sold was 59.63 units of 10 kilogram bags, which means that 596.3 kilograms of wheat were sold. Similarly, for each of the commodities, if we know the amount of money that was spent, we can calculate the quantity that was sold. Once we have the price times quantity is equal to money spent. We have the price, we have the money spent, we can calculate the total quantity purchased. So this in this table, the last column calculates the quantity. Quantity is just the sales volume divided by the price. And so this quantity tells us that in fiscal year 2008, 596 pounds of wheat flour was purchased, 50.39 thousand kilos of rice were purchased, 42,000 kilos of chicken were purchased, and so on. So this tells us about how much in terms of quantity in kilograms or liters was purchased in 2008. So this quantity is the key to creating a composite good, which we will discuss in the next slide using a simpler example. Instead of taking each commodity separately and doing a weighted average, we think of food as one good in which there is some portion of wheat and some portion of rice and some portion of chicken, and the quantities are given by the composition that we calculated last time. So we can say that, okay, food means 50 kilos of wheat, and 10 kilos of rice and 30 kilos of chicken and so on. So these quantities create a composite good which we call food. This is a new good. Now food is defined to be a certain amount of wheat and a certain amount of chicken and a certain amount of milk and so on. And so we just so this gives us one good. Now for this one good we can find the price in 2018 and we can find the price in 2019, and then we can compare this price and get an inflation rate. So basically the composite good, how do we get the composite good? Well, the current procedure is to calculate it from the aggregate consumption pattern of the nation as a whole, and in fact this was fixed in fiscal year 2008, and so this pattern has been, this is called the base for the price index. We will discuss this in greater detail in next. To better get a better idea of the composite good, we consider a case where there are only four things: wheat, rice, milk and chicken. And so now we consider a composite good which has 30 kilograms of wheat, 10 kilograms of rice, 50 liters of milk and 10 kilograms of chicken. Now the prices in 2018 of these four commodities were 180 rupees per kilo for wheat, 37 rupees per kilo for rice, 30 rupees per liter for milk and 80 rupees per kilo for chicken. So we multiply the quantity by the price to get the budget. So 5,400 rupees were spent on wheat, 370 on rice, 1,500 on milk and 800 on chicken. We add this all up and this gives us the budget, the total spending, which was 8,070. Now we take these same commodities, the same amount, 30 kilos of wheat, 10 kilos of rice, 50 of milk and 10 of chicken, and we multiply these by the 2019 prices. So we get the budget in the last column for 2019, and so these same four commodities in these precise quantities would cost 9,020 in 2019. So now we have a accurate picture of the inflation for this composite good. This, we can call this the food good. The food good, the food costs 8,070 in 2018 and it cost 9,020 in 2019. So the inflation rate can be calculated by taking the ratio of these two numbers and subtracting 1. This leads to 11.77%. And so that is the inflation rate. Now there is an important question of how do we choose this bundle? How do we get these 30 kilograms of wheat and 10 kilograms of rice? What happens if we change these numbers? What are the right numbers to choose? Should we have 50 kilograms of wheat and 100 kilograms of rice, or some other numbers? The inflation number we get depends on what we choose. The standard choice, the conventional choice, is to look at the consumption patterns for the base year, which is 2008 in PBS calculations, and it is currently being revised and updated to 2015. But there are other choices which are possible. Instead of looking at the nation as a whole, we can just look at one household. And so this is some illustrative data, artificial data. Suppose that in one household, the quantity purchased of wheat was 365, 220 for rice, 450 for milk, 120 liters for chicken, and 300 kilograms of pulse or dal. So this is the quantity in 2018, and the prices in 2018 are listed in the next column. So that allows us to compute the budget of the household. So this household spent 65,000 rupees on wheat, 8,000 on rice, 13,000 on milk, 9,000 on chicken, and 6,000 on pulse. So the total budget of the household was 1,02,940 or 102,940 rupees. Now we look at what happened in 2019, and the household changed the quantities. Though it used to purchase 365 units of wheat, now it purchased 400 kilos of wheat in 2019. the rice purchase went from 220 kilos in 2018 to 200 kilos in 2019, and similarly the milk consumption increased from 450 to 550 liters, the chicken consumption increased, the pulse consumption decreased. So there are new quantities and new prices, and we can calculate the new budget, and so it turns out that the budget for the household was 130,650 rupees. So can we say that the ratio of this budget is the inflation rate? Can we take the ratio of 130 to 102 and say that we have about 30% inflation? The answer is no. That is because the amount of goods has changed. Since the amount of goods has changed, we don't know if the increase in the budget is due to more purchase at the same price or the same quantity costing more. These two effects, both of these effects are present, and we cannot separate them. So the ratio of these two quantities is not the budget. We must keep the quantities the same if we want to measure inflation, so that there is no effect for changing quantities. But now, how can we keep the quantities the same when the quantities actually changed? So there are two obvious choices. We can just fix the quantities to be the ones for 2018, and this is called the Laspayre's method, or we can fix the quantities to be the ones purchased in 2019, and that is called the Paasche Index. So the previous year corresponds to Laspayre and the current year corresponds to Paasche. We will describe this more precisely in the next slide. So here's the calculation for the Laspayre price index. This is the same table as in the previous one, but instead of using the actual quantities purchased in 2019, we replace that column with the quantities that were purchased in 2018. So the quantities are now kept the same at the price at last year's quantity. This changes the budget in the last column, and now the new budget, in which the quantities are fixed at the same value, 2018, the new budget is 120,480. So now this is a measure of inflation. If we take the ratio of 120,480 to 102,940 and subtract 1, we get 17.04%, and this is the Laspayre measure for inflation. It is worth noting that this price being used here should not be actually the price in October. It should be the price averaged over the entire year, because we are looking at the budget for the whole year. But this is a minor technicality which we won't discuss in detail in this lecture. Instead of fixing the last year quantity, we can fix the quantities at the current year values. So here, this is the Paasche computation. Now we take the quantities in 2019 and we overwrite the 2018. Instead of the actual quantities purchased, we replace the quantities by the current year purchased quantities. And so this gives us a new budget for 2018 based on the question is that how much would these things that I purchased this year would have cost me last year if the prices were the same. So that comes out to now 112,900. And so now the Paasche measure of inflation is the ratio of these two numbers. It's 130,650 minus 1 over 112,900. The numbers are written incorrectly on the slide, and this comes out to 15.7%, which is rather different from the 17% we calculated last year. These are the two basic options, but there are other options. We can take the average of the quantities purchased in 2018 and 2019, or we can just take an average of the Paasche and Laspayre index, and there are other ways of doing this as well. So the question is, which of these is the correct method? So the thing to realize is that there is no single correct number which measures inflation. We should think of it as a qualitative phenomena. Inflation is not a single number. it's a phenomena of increasing prices which cannot be reduced to a single number. And a range of numbers may be suitable to understand the range of inflation, because different prices have changed differently and our budgets have changed, everything has changed. So one number cannot capture the process of inflation. Now, if we look at households, different households can have very different measures of inflation. So here is an illustration of how this can happen. So here we have one household which purchases only rice and pulse. So they have dal, chawal. And so the consumption of rice is 500 kilograms and pulse is also 500 kilograms, and they don't have any milk or chicken or wheat. So if we look at their budget in 2018, it comes out to 28,500 rupees. But when we look at 2019, it becomes 42,000. And that's because the price of pulse doubled from 20 rupees to 40 rupees. And since this house purchases a lot of pulse, so it had to double its expenses on pulse. And similarly, rice also increased a lot, and so that also contributes to the inflation. So if we calculate the inflation for this household, it will be 49%. They had their budget became substantially increased. It went from 28,000 to 42,000. So they suffered heavily from inflation. As opposed to this, look at a different household in the second panel. This household eats only wheat and milk and chicken, and if they eat wheat, milk and chicken, they have 500 units of wheat, 0 of rice, 500 liters of milk and 500 kilos of chicken, and no pulse at all. They don't eat any dal. So their budget in 2018 is 145,000, and in 2019 it's 160,000. So the total inflation rate is only 10%. So this is very different from the experience of the dal chawal group. So depending on what commodities you purchase, your inflation can be 11% or it can be 50%. So how can we use one number to describe both of these inflations? If we want to understand what is the range of possible numbers, we can just look at the price changes. So there are 5 categories, and in pulse we had 10% inflation, in rice it was 21%, in milk it was 16.7%, chicken was only 10%, but pulse was 100%. So all inflation will be calculated by looking at the distribution of weights among these 5 commodities. So if the weight is a lot on wheat and chicken, the inflation rate will be close to 10%. If there is a lot of weight on pulse, the inflation rate will be close to 100%. And different commodities, different combinations will give us a range of numbers between the smallest value of 10% and the largest value of 100%. This is the property of a weighted average. The weighted average of these 5 numbers can only lie between them. It will be close to the numbers which receive bigger weights, and it cannot go outside the boundaries of the smallest 10% and the largest 100%. So these are the range of inflation numbers which are possible, and which one we get depends on what is purchased. So each household can have its own inflation rate, which will depend on the amounts purchased of these 5 commodities. So in conclusion, we see that inflation rate varies by household. Each household can have its own inflation rate according to its purchase patterns. These purchase patterns also vary with time, so there is no single number for inflation even for one household, because if the purchase pattern changes, then you don't have a single commodity which is being priced. We can make arbitrary conventions. We can say, okay, fix the purchase pattern at last year. That gives us the Laspayre index. Or we can say fix the purchase pattern at current year. This gives us the Paasche index. But these are all conventions. These are artificial. There is no natural way of creating a consumption bundle. So these numbers, the Paasche, the Laspayres, they should be taken as indicators of inflation and not as an accurate measure. No single number can describe inflation for even one household, let alone the country as a whole. And also taking the aggregate consumption for the country as a whole, which is what is currently done, is not a good idea. And particularly taking the consumption bundle in 2008, because these are the numbers which are available. Again, this is a very misleading and inaccurate methodology. It is possible to get more accurate measures by stratifying the population according to the consumption patterns. So the poor people have one kind of consumption pattern. People in one region have other kinds of consumption patterns. People who are rich have other kinds of consumption patterns. So if we take into account similar consumption patterns, then we will see similar rates of inflation. These patterns also change according to the prices. If dal becomes more expensive, people will purchase less of it. Also, we can induce change by running a campaign. We can say that, okay, tofu, for example, is relatively unknown in Pakistani diet, but it is a high protein and cheap to produce. So we can run a campaign to introduce this to the population, and that would also cause change in the what is being purchased, and it would also cause a change in the inflation index, because if more of a cheap quantity is produced and consumed, then the inflation rate would be lower. So these are all complications which arise when you think about the big picture instead of confining attention to just the numbers without worrying about the real world context which produces the numbers. So with that, we end this lecture.